We are now going to welcome back Malcolm Langford, Professor of Public Law and Director of CEL, Centre for Excellence in Education. He began his career working at the Australian Human Rights Commission and Centre on Housing and Evictions in Geneva. As a lawyer, social scientist, and author, Malcolm crosses many legal fields, examining his own advocacy, because you also have an activist streak, one could say, and advising governments and international organizations. A warm welcome to the Letten Seminar, Malcolm Langford.
Thanks very much. Thanks to the Letten Prize, and a special thanks or congratulations to you for giving the award to Tarunabh, who has really lightened up the field of constitutional law with his brilliance, but also his engagement in Indian public life. As a 15-year-old at the other end of the world, I chose law and economics because I wanted to make a difference. The plan was politics. But I came of age in the 1980s. It was human rights and environment that mattered then, for many in my generation. So I chose the former, and I spent 8 years working in Australia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, especially on housing rights, and most deeply in Kenya, with local communities on issues of forced eviction and slum upgrading and resettlement. It was a journey in itself, seeing the potential of human rights advocacy to make real material differences in people's lives and power structures. It was also a lesson on the limits of human rights, the limits of international organisations, the limits of local and international elites like ourselves, and ultimately the white man's burden. In 2007, I moved to Norway and stumbled accidentally into the role of a full-time academic. Accidents do happen. The last 14 years has been a different journey of seeking to reconcile the slow scientific rigour of the academy with the urgent cry for necessary social change, the head and the heart, to put it in very banal terms. In speaking with students about this tension, I often contrast two figures, Noam Chomsky and today Mariana Mazzucato. Chomsky is a world-renowned linguist by day and equally renowned social critic by night. Mazzucato is a star Italian-British economist whose work on reforming capitalism is at the core of her research. She mobilises constantly and thoughtfully the resources in her discipline, the so-called dismal science of economics, for public policy. In my view, both approaches have their virtues. The first maintains the distinction, a clear distinction in roles, and maintains the legitimacy of the scholar. The second harnesses the transformative power of scholarship. Either, done well, is commendable. Either, done poorly, deserves reflection. It's a choice, I believe, that each must make in their own context, and academia is arguably served by diversity. So it's nice to be, for example, the token white male today on the panel. One of the most remarkable and striking women I have met in academia is Stella Nyanzi, a widely cited Ugandan academic and anthropologist turned activist. An extremely sharp mind, but her method is radical rudeness. Her academic presentations had a way of making you remarkably personally uncomfortable. And once I had to moderate a session with African judges who were up in arms, who almost wanted to throttle her. She's been jailed for profound poetry about Uganda's president, which earned her an 18-month prison sentence. As the verdict was read in court, she bared her breasts and shouted insults at the judge. Her rudeness, though, created a platform in Uganda and was one way of channeling anger for many against the regime. Whether you choose the Chomsky approach or the Mazzucato approach, both are difficult in practice. And the key to finding one's role and navigating it lies, I believe, in the idea of responsiveness and some key dialectics, which you've really, in many ways, already heard today. In my PhD, I argued that the idea of responsive law has two dimensions. It is justice-seeking, seeking to make a material or political difference, but is also reflective and self-conscious. One is not simply responsive to immediate needs in society, but is humble enough to understand that justice long-term must be secured in institutions, democracy in the rule of law. There must be also responsiveness to other actors, even if they are powerful and must be challenged. The same, I believe, could be said of the responsive legal scholar. Justice-seeking, as our keynote spoke about today, but also self-conscious and reflective about their roles, as he also spoke about. In this respect, I want to comment more concretely on two ways of navigating this space. The first is critical empiricism. My experience in researching and engaging in many fields, human rights, international investment law, constitutional law, and now also legal technology, is that polarization is more present than absent. And this creates deep challenges for the responsive scholar. In many of these fields, justice-seeking is simply taking a side, is simply playing politics. It creates little respect. And this was even more acute when I've been researching the impact of my own work and colleagues' work, for example, in the field of social rights. How do you maintain a distance? I believe a useful approach is what we can call critical empiricism. To engage critically, to speak truth to power, but to engage the resources of scholarship, the repertoire of empirical methods and normative thinking we have, and a commitment to objectivity. As Redhead argues in his article on critical modernity, this requires a constant reflexivity, a relentless reviewing of processes and methods and continual reinvention of vocabulary to check what we are doing, keeping our eye on the critical goal, but challenging the work of our hands. And importantly, being open to contrary or different results. Even if we engage with social movements, we must also be a critical reflex for them, I believe. I've experienced this particularly strongly in the work of the very polarised field of international investment arbitration. By taking a statistical approach, using, for example, quantitative network analysis, in determining the extent of non-transparent arbitral networks, the stale, male and pale networks of international law, we've been able to shed some light on the field, the extent of the problem, and recently helped states and other actors work towards a compromise and a code of conduct in the United Nations. But interesting some of this research with a colleague who has very different normative views than mine, but a commitment to empirical method, I've also had to challenge many of my own preconceptions and perhaps some of my biases against the field. Critical empiricism, therefore, captures what I believe is a first simple reflexive approach, or basically a lesson I try to take each day. If a field is populated by many actors, play the academic. It's a real contribution. If no one, though, is making normative claims, it's a very unpopulated field, engage as a public intellectual. It is also a real contribution, being reflexive to the context. Moreover, such an approach allows us to speak also truth to academic power. We heard about Cass Sunstein in 1991 today, and we could also talk about Cass Sunstein in the early 2000s. But it also means speaking truth to our own personal academic power. The second is critical empathy. Much of our social engagement is generated by empathy, an effective solidarity with the situation of those suffering disadvantage. But this is also a trap, so-called doxic empathy. Today in the world, we have what Steven Pinker has called an empathy craze. From empathy projects in schools, conspicuous empathy of politicians, to business consultants that extol empathy training for maximising profits, and development workers that are sent off to the global south to learn to empathise and return to the global north to speak on behalf of the oppressed. In the process affirming, as Lob has said, the global neoliberal order. The hard and deep question for many academics is what is driving our empathy and what is its role? In Paulo Freire's famous Pedagogy of the Impressed, empathy is also present, expressed for the suffering of the disadvantaged and oppressed. But it is dialogic and reflexive, with an acute of awareness of the asymmetry in powers. Dedicated to a project of vesting authority and political literacy away from themselves and towards the members of the oppressed community as respected co-creators of an embodied knowledge of social suffering. And we've just heard a very powerful speech from Sanjeep on precisely this in Bangladesh. If we engage with critical empathy with these social movements demanding the death penalty, how do we engage as international human rights activists who view the death penalty as anathema? I believe critical empathy provides us resources for that conversation, rather than just seeking to reject it in simple terms. When we choose to engage, we need to ask what motivates us. Is it a doxic empathy that makes us look good on social media or in research applications? Or a critical empathy that is truly committed to social transformation? And it may be an empathy that requires letting go of our academic power as much as brandishing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Any questions for Malcolm or comments? We have a little bit of time before the break. Yes?
My name is Inge Sand from the University of Oslo and the Faculty of Law here. Thank you so much for this and also for all the other lectures we've heard today. And my question maybe also goes to the others, but I think you pinpointed in many ways. Academic truth is a vital goal, but today we're also seeing that that is also a very complex thing. There may be many truths around there, and we work from many different perspectives, and also being a very objective and trying to be a very scientifically objective researcher, we're faced with the complexity of the world and the very many different contexts and perspectives we need to take into consideration. And I think you showed that very clearly here, and I think your concepts of critical empathy and empiricism are really important. But does this mean that we need to sort of enlarge or broaden our academic methods into including both the concepts you showed, but also to place ourselves contextually, to demand the researchers that we always place ourselves in a context, explain that context, and when we go into more singular questions, that we always try to explain them in a broader societal context in order to say what are the preconditions and what do I study and what do I not study in order to have a more societal concept of academic truth. Please.
Thank you.
Thanks for a wonderful question. So if we are to be self-critical, engage in critical empiricism, that also means, as I indicated, being critical to our own methods. And most of us as academics learn pretty much one method. But anyone who studies Aristotle, and most people do at some point, knows that there are three types of knowledge. There is the observational, there is the revelatory, which lawyers are very concerned with, Moses who came down with the 10 Commandments, or the Parliament that comes down with all these laws. We read them, we interpret them like religious scholars, like doctrine. And the third is, logic and rationalism. But within each of these, there are many methods. Within observational approaches, we have quantitative and we have qualitative approaches. We now have computational approaches. And we need all of this if we're only going to get a sense of what is actually true. So I believe one of the great dangers in academia is this hegemonic approach within disciplines, where we believe that we have this sort of sole understanding of the truth and a lack of respect for other methodological traditions. And there's the famous story of, all the blind scientists feeling different parts of the elephant and describing very different things. So it's a tree when I hold the leg of the elephant. When I'm holding the trunk, no, it's a snake. But together, perhaps we can see the whole elephant. But I think, Inge, you take it further in a very important way, which many of us have been into, is that also there is a truth outside academia, a truth that's not necessarily based in the long epistemological traditions that we have, but there is the truth of experience. And I counted this both in activism as an academic, listening to communities, finding my own understanding of, for example, informal settlements in Kenya completely turned upside down, understanding the complexities of power at the local level, the economies at the local level, the way in which people actually live dignified lives in that context, and perhaps had different demands than the ones that good-meaning northerners thought that they actually had. And I think the example of Bangladesh takes it even further in terms of what these truths might be. So we need an epistemological openness as much as we need an epistemological rigour.
Thank you. I was actually thinking about the other lecturers while you were speaking, because you said the responsive scholar is justice-seeking. Yes? The responsive scholar is reflexive. There was a lot of reflection, and the responsive scholar is self-conscious. I could see that in the former lectures. What do you think? Deeply.
I think I was really affected by the other lectures, so it's been a real privilege, actually, to be here today. I'm not sure if Sanjeev wants to respond at all to that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Could you quickly just repeat that question again, just so that...
According to Malcolm, the responsive scholar is self-conscious,
Yes.
reflexive, and seeks justice.
Yeah.
And when I was listening to you and the others, I could see that all of you have some of these traits.
I certainly hope so. One thing that I've constantly tried is to be self-critical, and I've often found that after the passage of some time, when there is a degree of distance from the event itself, the moment of activism, distance actually helps. And it allows you to think back and reassess the things you've done. And it actually allows you to be self-critical. And one thing for sure is, let's say, the person that I was 10 years ago is quite different from the person that I am now. And I would hope that it applies to all scholars. It would be a pity if we were static and didn't evolve or change. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. Yes, Malcolm, would you like to say something before we go for our break? Round off for us?
I think it's a very good point about time. And often, when I look back on my own activism and academia engagement, you think about things you would have done differently or other things you might be proud of. But I think a key challenge for us is, how do we create time now? How do I get time in a world of acceleration, demands, both academic, as Tarunabh was talking about, and in the social world? And that requires personal, if not spiritual, resources to get that sense of distance, that space, to understand what will I engage in, how will I engage it, how will I create, how will I make an academic contribution in that context. And so I think it's a profound thing that Sanjeev is saying about time, but how do we create time and distance right now? I think that is critical for all of us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you.